Hey, welcome to the channel. I'm pretty excited today to be building a computer again. I really enjoy building computers, even though it can be kind of frustrating sometimes. But my wife recently asked me if I could build her a little desktop computer just for kind of like light computational work, like web browsing, Microsoft Office, those types of tasks, so nothing super graphically or computationally intensive. So with that in mind, these are the parts that I selected. So all of these parts came in at around 500 bucks, just a little bit under. So if you want to build something for the use case that I just outlined, plus you could do some gaming with it. If you're into gaming at 1080p, probably low to medium settings depending on the game, then yeah, I'll walk through the parts with you and show you what I selected and why. Starting with the case, so this is the Fractal Design Node 202. It's been out for a while. It's a small form factor mini ITX case. This case also has, there are two versions of it, one that comes with a power supply and one without. So I got the version that comes with a power supply. And if you are building a mini ITX system in a truly small form factor case, you might have to go with a small form factor power supply, which this has. So you'll be looking at a power supply with a SFX designation, and they're not quite as widespread or common. There's not as many options available in that form factor as a full-size ATX power supply, and they're going to be just a little bit more expensive in general for a comparable power supply to a full-size ATX. But this is a 450 watt bronze rated unit, so it's more than enough for what we have, with enough headroom to add in a budget to mid-range GPU down the line. For the processor, I went with the Ryzen 3200G, so this is the latest generation Ryzen APUs. So the APUs have the CPU and the graphics unit GPU built in. So we do not need a discrete graphics card with this system. If we want to upgrade down the line, we can. This is the 4-core, 4-thread, so no hyper-threading or whatever AMD calls it in this CPU, but there is the Ryzen 3400G. If you want to spend about $50 more, you'll get 4 cores and 8 threads. Next, you're probably going to want to select your motherboard. So I went with this ASRock Vitality B450. Gaming ITX AC, so the AC designation means there's Wi-Fi built into this. So if you do need Wi-Fi, keep that in mind when shopping a motherboard. Usually there is a non-Wi-Fi and a Wi-Fi version for a lot of motherboards. So one really great thing about Ryzen from AMD is they all work on the same chipset. From the very first Ryzen CPUs that came out in 2017 all the way up until now, and I think until the next year or two with future Ryzen releases, they all work on the same chipset. So what that means is they work on the AM4 chipset, and so really any motherboard that you buy that's AM4, any generation of Ryzen will work in that motherboard, with the potential caveat that you might need a BIOS update to enable the motherboard to work with future Ryzen processors. The good thing about this motherboard, and this is, I don't know for sure, but it says that it's Ryzen 3000 desktop ready. So it should have the latest BIOS release enabling compatibility with the latest Ryzen CPUs. So if the CPU doesn't work out of the box with this motherboard, you have a couple of options. AMD has a program where you have to fill out a form. They will ship you a temporary CPU where you can install it and then update the BIOS, and then install your CPU, and then send them back their temporary CPU. Other options would be to find a local computer repair shop or computer sales store or something like that in your area, and see if they can do the BIOS update for you. Some motherboards also have the ability to flash or update the BIOS without a CPU installed. Those motherboards tend to be a little bit more expensive. Next, we'll take a look at the RAM. I just went with an 8 gig kit, so this is a 2x4 gig. With mini ITX motherboards, you typically are only going to have 2 RAM slots. 8 gigs seems to be enough for what we're doing with it. You could always go for 16 if you wanted to. It'll definitely future-proof you a little bit better. Games are starting to use more and more RAM. One thing you want to keep in mind with Ryzen is the faster memory speed you can get, the better. I think a sweet spot for most Ryzen processors is probably 3200 megahertz, which is what I went with here. And lastly, for storage, I didn't buy any storage for this computer. I had a couple of old Samsung 850 Pros from old builds that I wasn't using anymore, and so I figured I'd just utilize them for this build. These are only 128 gigs a piece, but you can easily get 500 gigs for about $50, $60, depending on the brand, depending on the form factor. And even 1 terabyte drives nowadays are usually around 100 to 130 bucks. This case supports exactly two 2.5-inch SSDs, so we'll be maxing out the capacity of the case. But the motherboard supports the M.2 form factor, so you could go with M.2, whether that's SATA 6 gig or NVMe. So just go with whatever you can afford, the biggest capacity that you can afford. So those are the parts. All we need is just space and hopefully just a Phillips screwdriver. Oh, and I forgot to mention, CPU cooler. We're going to use the cooler that comes with this CPU. It's going to be plenty for what we need. If you do want to add an aftermarket cooler, if you get a faster CPU than we have, one that puts out more heat, you can definitely go that route, but keep in mind with a case like this, you're going to be limited in the form factor. I don't remember the exact dimensions. It's somewhere around 55 millimeters, I think, is the maximum height of the CPU cooler that you can fit into this case. But of course, that's going to be case dependent. Just check the specs of your case. Okay, let's get to building.